Don't adjust your television sets. Don't squint too hard. Yes, Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl back together again.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This upcoming October will be my 10th NHL season doing digital hockey content, and I could not be more grateful to everyone who is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every single day. And today's edition of Locked On Oilers is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com, and you could win up to $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to break down what it means for the lineup as a whole if Chris Knoblauch follows through with what we've seen so far in the preseason, where Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl have played together, and every indication is that in the absence of Zach Hyman, Chris Knoblauch is going to pursue McDavid and Draisaitl together, what that does for the rest of the lineup, whether or not it's a good idea. So we're going to start out with just the vacuum, why you would do this with the circumstances you're being dealt. In our second segment, we'll pivot to the trickle-down effect of if you play Connor and Leon together on the first line, what that does to some of the other spots. And then we'll tie a bow on this episode by talking about the bigger picture, what it means for the team at large, and what it might indicate about some of Chris Knoblauch's mindset. So to start out, I don't think it's a coincidence that Chris Knoblauch's going here right away. And one of the great differences between the way a coach thinks and the way a media member or a fan thinks is floor versus ceiling. When you're a coach, you are looking for as high a floor as you can possibly create. Your hope, if you are a coach, is to give yourself a chance to win every single game. Now, sometimes that comes to the detriment of long-term trajectory. Sometimes that comes to the detriment of the ability of your team to get to a high ceiling. And not one or the other is particularly more with merit than the other when we are talking about this specific instance. I think there is a world where this works, where because Chris Knoblauch looks at this lineup and says, if I split Connor and Leon up, I'm going to have to work harder to get them to create offense. When I play the two of them together, and we can presume that if Connor and Leon are going to play together at 5-on-5, they would most of the time get deployment with Ekholm and Bouchard, that would put them in a position to outright control the game for 16 to 17 minutes per game at 5-on-5. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think you saw Chris Knoblauch leaning on this in the Stanley Cup Final last year against Florida. Some would say to his detriment. I think, in my opinion, I was a little disappointed with Knoblauch's unwillingness to adjust or maybe experiment in the Stanley Cup Final, just because it wasn't particularly working. And when I say working, we have to account for process and results, because in just life in general, you can do all of the right things. You can go about your business. You can put the work in. You can practice. You can get better. You can watch yourself get better. You can feel yourself get stronger. But that does not necessarily mean the outcome you're working towards is going to happen. Sometimes you put in all the work, you make all the right plays, and you miss the net. The goalie makes the save. The shot gets blocked on the way in. And in this case, in the Stanley Cup Final last year, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself jumping on some of the stats I had for the second segment, this was Chris Knoblauch's gambit. He said, I'm going to play Connor and Leon together at 5-on-5, and if nothing else, we are going to win those minutes. We are going to win the minutes Connor and Leon are out there, and that is going to keep us in every game. The problem for Chris Knoblauch was Connor and Leon were controlling the game. They had a majority of the possession. They had a majority of the expected goals, majority of the high danger chances. They were buttressed by Evan Bouchard. They played a bit with Corey Perry, a bit with Evander Kane, a bit. Wow, I could not say Vasily as in Vasily Podkolzin, who if you haven't heard, Podkolzin is on a temporary leave of absence. He went back to Russia, had a death in the family. So sending our best to Vasily Podkolzin, somebody who I've really grown fond of over the last year and change as a member of the Oilers. So all thoughts with him, hoping for the best there. Hope he is able to see family and take account and just get to reflect a little bit. And it's unfortunate that sometimes life has to grab us by the shoulders and force us to reflect, but it's okay. It is unfortunately a part of life to suffer loss, especially as you get older. But our best to Podkolzin, who I think is going to play an important role on this team, someone we dedicated a whole episode to earlier in the week, somebody I generally am pretty optimistic about the trajectory of what he could do. But in this context, talking about the Oilers' first line in the Stanley Cup Final, the mindset was, we know Florida is going to probably win a majority of the minutes in these games when we play Connor and Leon together. But if we put the two of them out there, they're going to keep us in these games. And the numbers over the last 2 years are great. 62% of the scoring chances, 64% of the goals, 63% of the expected goals, 53% of the high danger chances, 11.8 shooting percentage, 901 save percentage. And then the other part of this is just a simple, our guys are better than you. That is what putting Connor and Leon out there, and by extension, Evan Bouchard and Ekholm out there, over the last 2 years, when the Oilers put those guys out there, that is the Oilers saying, we are winning the next 40 seconds of this game. And those 40-second instances, I go back to the old John Tortorella, one good shift at a time, one good period at a time, one good game at a time. You string together a couple good plays, you have a good shift. That's your goal. And when you have a guaranteed good shift every 3 times over the boards, you are in good shape. Now, that does have a trickle-down effect, which we're going to talk about in our second segment. And I want to get back to my initial point and close out on it. When we're talking about floor versus ceiling, putting Connor and Leon together is about raising the floor, is about giving yourself a chance in as many situations as possible to win with those guys, to put your best players in a position where they amplify each other's best traits, they control the game, and you control every third, every fourth shift in a given game. You're going to give yourself a pretty good chance to win that game. Now, as far as process and results go, one of the keys to understanding why I might be a bit more hesitant about it this specific instance than I might have been in years past was last year's Stanley Cup Final, where Connor and Leon did not get the results, even though the process was good. And that was the point I wanted to make as far as process versus results. You can control possession. You can have a majority of the dangerous offense. You can have the puck in the other end of the ice for 45 seconds, a minute, minute and a half. But if you're circling the offensive zone, if you need to string together 7, 8, 9, 10 passes in a row to create one dangerous scoring chance, that's a real challenge. And there was a sequence in Game 7 2 years ago in the Stanley Cup Final where I started to take tallies every time the Oilers would gain the offensive zone. How many passes would it take to get one shot on goal? And there was a sequence where the Oilers passed the puck 12 times before it ended in a Zach Hyman shot from the slot. That was pretty good. And that's 12 passes to get one scoring chance. So think about how many passes you would need to generate to create 10 of those. If you need to string together 100 passes over the course of a given period to generate 10 chances, so maybe one of those 10, if you're a league average shooting team, which is about 10%, goes in. That's the efficiency reality you're facing in today's NHL. And for the Oilers in the Stanley Cup Final this past year, it didn't work. And coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we'll talk about why it didn't work and what it means for the Oilers if they want to pursue McDavid and Draisaitl together this upcoming season right after this. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer, because right now, new FanDuel customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use on the FanDuel app. I love using FanDuel because it makes however you like to play happen. If you want to bet player props instead of the game, if you want to cook up a same game parlay for a squad ride with your friends, or if you have a feeling as the game's happening, live betting is the way to go. Pretty good slate in the NFL this weekend. Huge game in the NFC. The Eagles going down to Tampa, where the Eagles are 3.5-point road favorites. Both those teams looking to stay undefeated. Jackson Dart making his first NFL start for my Giants as 6.5-point home underdogs against the undefeated Chargers and Jim Harbaugh. And then the main event, loser leaves town. Two teams with Super Bowl aspirations, both 1-2. You don't want to fall to 1-3. The Baltimore Ravens, Lamar, going into Kansas City Arrowhead to take on Mahomes and the Chiefs, where the Ravens 2.5-point favorites on the road. So FanDuel has one question. Are you ready? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started right now. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet for your chance at $300 in bonus bets. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are approaching the second to last week of the dreadedly long, yes, I am saying dreadedly long offseason. And I know the Oilers have made my life easier the last two summers by playing into late June. There's a lot more to talk about. I was talking to some of the other Locked On hosts who had teams who didn't make the playoffs last year, and they were a bit jealous. We had hockey to talk about into June. I mean, if you miss the playoffs, you got 2 weeks of April, May, June. You get free agency in the draft. That helps. But you're talking about 4 or 5 months of content without hockey. So I do say, from my perspective, yes, it's been long, but it is important to keep things in perspective, to not lose sight. You know, comparison is the enemy of joy. And I am very grateful that the Oilers are returning to actual hockey, not preseason hockey, actual hockey in the not so distant future. And it's going to make doing this all the more fun with actual games to break down and diagnose. So continuing our conversation, talking about McDavid-Draisaitl together, ceiling, floor. When you play Connor and Leon together, you are upping the ante. You are raising the stakes. You are making it more difficult for the rest of your lineup. And that's multifaceted. So first, when you play Connor and Leon together, you are by definition changing the rest of your lineup into a high floor team. When you are playing Connor and Leon together, the rest of your lineup is going to struggle to create zone entries. So when you can't carry the puck into the offensive zone with speed, you can't create conflict for defenders and goaltenders, you are becoming more predictable. And look, every team needs to have dump and chase and cycle in their repertoire. This is not an indictment of dump and chase hockey as a whole. Ideally, your team should be able to do both. Your team should be able to run and gun, transition, east-west, get the puck on net, dangerous, move your goalie left to right. But it also needs to be able to hunker down and get pucks in deep and to grind it out. The problem becomes defenses can start to hone in on your tendencies, and over the course of a playoff series, it becomes a bit more habitual because you're playing the same team over and over again. Guys start to get familiar with each other. They get matchup understandings, tendencies understandings, and it changes the way the structure works. Because if you're playing a team that's just dump and chase, dump and chase, dump and chase, dump and chase, as long as you're okay skating, you're going to be okay with that. If you're the Panthers, who have a reasonably mobile defensive core, Forsling, Ekblad, Mikula, Seth Jones, they're all pretty strong skaters. Kulikov's not a bad skater. All of those guys don't mind turning their back to you because they know they get below the blue line, one pass, we're back going the other way, and we have the foot speed to get that puck where it needs to go. We have the transition ability, the puck ability to get it where we want it. Now, when you are playing a team like the Oilers, who, when their best players are all together, you are making the rest of your lineup's goal, don't lose us the game. And that's a hard way to live if you're Adam Henrique, if you're Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, if he's not playing with McDavid and Draisaitl, if you're down the lineup, if you're Tomasek, if you're Ike Howard, if you're Matthew Savoie, if your instructions are, okay, let's get that puck in deep, there is merit to that. There is value in cycling the puck and trying to wear down the defense and trying to draw penalties. That's all valuable. The problem becomes when all of your upside, when all of your dynamic ability is in one place, all they need to do, all your opponent needs to do is survive those minutes. And last year in the Stanley Cup Final, the Panthers won the McDavid-Draisaitl minutes. Now, again, the process was good. I'm going to click on over to my stats here so I make sure I cite them correctly. The Oilers had 60% of the expected goals in the Stanley Cup Final last year. 60% of the expected goals, 62% of the shots, 62% of the scoring chances, 63% of the high danger chances. In the 70 minutes of 5-on-5 hockey McDavid and Draisaitl played together, they were outscored 5-1 by the Florida Panthers. So let's unpack that. If you are getting thumped and 5-1 outscoring is getting thumped, what is the rest of your lineup supposed to do? What is the rest of your lineup supposed to do? And look, to their credit, in the non-McDavid-Draisaitl minutes, the Oilers held their own. It was 4-4 at 5-on-5. That's more than enough. So, I know I've been a bit critical of the way Chris Knoblauch handled the lineup in the final. I wanted more shakeup. I wanted more opportunity. And there was a chance. And the reason I hone in on the word chance is, if your supporting cast is playing Florida's to a push, and you think about what Florida's supporting cast is versus what Edmonton's is, where we're talking about Anton Lundell and Brad Marchand and Verhaeghe and Bennett against Henrique and Nugent-Hopkins and Connor Brown and Evander Kane, there's a real talent disparity there between the depth of the Panthers and the depth of the Oilers. And the Oilers' depth was game. The Oilers' depth played Florida to a push at 5-on-5. If that's the case, you need to win. And it's frustrating because the process was there. The shooting percentage was not there. The save percentage was not there. And look, I am not a guy who does a lot of relitigating, especially I don't like doing the deserves to win. I think anytime you as a commentator say that team deserved to win, I think you're missing out on the fundamental point that execution is a part of deserving to win. And some of it's variance, some of it's just bad luck. And you can say that. That's okay. I do think the Oilers had a bit of bad luck in the Stanley Cup Final last year. They couldn't get a bounce. They couldn't get something to go their way. Some of that was a byproduct of their penalty kill being atrocious. Some of that was a byproduct of their power play not being as efficient as it had been in the past. I think we're having a very different conversation right now. If the power play and the penalty kill are going the way they're supposed to, you probably get to a Game 7. Or if McDavid and Draisaitl, by virtue of having 60% of the shots, scoring chances, expected goals, and high danger chances, if that's a push, if it's, 3-3, 5-5, if it's something like that, I think the series coming down to special teams, I think there's a world where the Oilers are maybe a bit better on special teams, but that's neither here nor there. The point that's pertinent to this conversation about this upcoming season, and what we'll unpack coming up in our final segment, when you have this gift, and having McDavid and Draisaitl on the same team is a gift in of itself, when you get to play them together, I don't think that should be your default. And we'll talk more about that coming up next, but real quick, there is the capacity for this to go very well, especially in the regular season where you get to play the Seattles of the world. You get to play the Detroits, the Buffaloes. When you get to play the mediocre and bad teams of our league, and you get to load up Connor and Leon together, you're going to have a good time. It's the opposite of the South Park joke about having a bad time, but that will do it. We're going to take one more quick break. Coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, I'm going to tell you what Chris Knoblauch going to these two guys out of the gate tells me about where his mindset's at and what he thinks about the state of his team. Coming up next. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers ahead of a weekend that I sorely need, working through a cold. And look, as a man, I'm allowed to make the joke about having a cold, feeling like dying, being too much, but it is so annoying doing a podcast breathing out of my mouth. I hope the extra breathing on the show hasn't deterred you if you're an everyday or if you're new around here. I hope it hasn't totally turned you off to the show, because as the season gets going, we really get to hit our stride. We get to break out the dry erase board. We get to break out stills from game frames and walk through given sequences, what makes the play work, what makes the play doesn't work. And at this point, it feels like we have a pretty firm understanding of what Chris Knoblauch thinks and where he might be going. And what I mean by that, as we've been talking about, the bigger reason and the main takeaway about loading up Connor and Leon together is the idea that the Oilers are playing for the playoffs. And there's a few layers to that. So number one, Chris Knoblauch knows the expectations are not just to make the playoffs. It's not even to just win a round. He knows that if the Oilers don't at least make the conference final, there will be a perception that this season was a failure. And the reason I say conference final is if you lose to Dallas in 6 or 7, you lose to Vegas in 6 or 7, Colorado in 6 or 7, I don't think anybody's going to begrudge you if you lose a hard-fought series to a really good team. I think there's an understanding there. You go out in the first round to LA, if you go out in the first round to Utah or Winnipeg or Minnesota, I think that would get some dirty looks. I think that would get some conversation. And I talked about this the other day, the idea of the Oilers needing to get off to a good start to the regular season this year to kind of buck their historical trend of the last couple. When you come out of the gate strong, that empowers your coach and gives your coach a chance to figure things out. There's less of a hair on fire, oh my God, what do I do? And more of a, okay, we are playing well. Our guys are building confidence. What does it look like if Savoie plays with more confidence? What does it look like if Tomasek plays with more confidence? And I think part of the reason you would go McDavid-Draisaitl together out of the gate with Trent Frederick, who's going to be their Zach Hyman facsimile. He's going to go chase the puck. He's going to forecheck. He's going to hit things. I think you do that to raise the floor of your team. I think that's telling Savoie and Howard, we're going to bring you guys along slowly. There are merits to that. I think giving them a chance to get their feet under them, adjust to the NHL grind, adjust to NHL speed, I think there's plenty of merit to that. I think as a team that has Stanley Cup aspirations, you want to bring those guys along at a pace that's not asking them to do too much, that's not asking them or putting them in a vulnerable position. Now, there are drawbacks to that. I am always a proponent of trying to see what a young guy can do. I would like to see Savoie and Ike Howard get run in the top 6 and on the power play at various points this year. But for right now, bringing those guys along slowly is fine, especially without Zach Hyman. Being that you need to fill 4 top 6 forward spots without Zach Hyman, I think Chris Knoblauch is entitled to build the lineup a little more safe. And if you're going to go McDavid, Draisaitl, Tomasek, or Nugent-Hopkins, or Henrique, or whoever you're thinking down the middle, for right now, this is okay. For right now, this is okay. You know what you're going to get from Connor and Leon together. That's going to give you a really high baseline. You get those guys out there with Bouchard and Ekholm, you should dominate those minutes. You should have 15 to 16 minutes of the game where you are getting 65% of the expected goals, and you should be able to score 1 or 2 goals every game. And look, I know that sounds crazy, but they really should. They really should be able to be good for, between the 3 of those guys, be good for at least 1 to 2 goals a game, if not more. With that as a baseline, you're telling Howard, Savoie, Nuge, Henrique, Tomasek, Janmark, whoever else you're thinking of, Kapanen, Podkolzin, you're telling those guys, okay, our big guns are going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Your job is to get the puck in deep. It is to cycle. It is to play high to low. It is to put pressure on their defense. It is to tire them out. It is to make their goalie work. And I do think there is some value in that. I think the Oilers did a great job of that, especially in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs against LA once they got their feet under them, and against Vegas where, okay, McDavid and Draisaitl are out there. They're out there to score. Everyone else, that Henrique, Nugent-Hopkins, and Zach Hyman line, the second line they were running in that Vegas series, they were hitting everything that moved. Before Zach Hyman broke his wrist, He was 10 hits away from the most hits anybody had ever had in a Stanley Cup Final run. And the record holder, I believe, who was Blake Coleman, had 10 more. And he played in another 5 or 6 games in a Stanley Cup Final. And Zach Hyman got to a 4th game of the conference final, and he was only 10 away. So I think that goes to show you that the Oilers do have some of that in their repertoire. And I think that plays into what the Oilers want to do. You know, when we did that defensive preview episode like a week or so ago, one of the key points I made was not necessarily that the Oilers are a good defensive team in the traditional sense. They don't take away shooting lanes all that great. They don't block a ton of shots. What makes them good is their situational ability. It's their ability to break up passes and go the other way. It's their ability to help transition from defense to offense quickly. And what that does for offense, because the more offense you're playing, the less defense you're playing. And that's one of the tricks here. When you are a strong team that only has to play situational defense, that's putting your guys in a lot better position. And I think, and again, this is anecdotal, there are a lot of guys who just haven't played together before. There are guys on this team who have no familiarity, who have no chemistry with each other. So what does that mean? That means we need to dumb things down a little bit. That means we need to keep things simple. And I think there is a world where this works fine until Zach Hyman comes back. Once Zach Hyman comes back, then I think there's a conversation about breaking this up. Then I think there's a conversation about, well, we can go back to Connor and Leon driving their own lines. And what do we do there? We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But for right now, raising the floor is fine. When you're missing a key player, and make no mistake about it, Zach Hyman is the 4th most important player on this team. That is their best non-McDavid or Draisaitl forward. Once they have Hyman back, then we could maybe say, let's try Savoie with Leon. Let's try Nugent-Hopkins back on the first line and see if he's got a little more pep in his step, or if last year was foreboding of what was to come as far as his foot speed and his instincts, his positioning. I want to see this Oilers team start off at a reasonable pace. And look, I'm not saying anything crazy. They don't have to do what the Jets did last year. You know, the Jets came out of the gate 14-1, 15-1 last year. All the Oilers got to do is not be a tire fire. And they were rough out of the gate last year. It took them a month to get going. But this team has a lot of talent. It doesn't necessarily have as much certainty, but the capacity to be a good team is here. And starting out with a good foundation helps. Starting out with that high floor should allow them to get off to a reasonable start. Get off to a reasonable start, bank as many points as you can, be in a playoff spot come American Thanksgiving, and then when push comes to shove, make it happen. For now, this is fine. Obviously, as we all know, lines, chemistry, it changes throughout the course of the season. We will probably see a little bit of everything. But it makes sense that on a veteran-laden team, on a coach who has a pretty good understanding of his players and what they like to do and what makes them successful, that he would go back to the well. You know, the SpongeBob old reliable, cracking open the net, going jellyfishing. That's what Chris Knoblauch's doing right now. Go back to what's familiar, get your feet under you, get off to a good start. Then once your feet are under you, then once Zach Hyman's back, then we could start getting a little crazy. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you so much to everyone that made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe if you're on Apple or Spotify. Take an extra second, leave the show a 5-star review. It would be greatly appreciated. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, hit that alarm bell, get notifications whenever new episodes go live. Be sure to check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night in the ramp up to the start of the 2025 season, so you get everything you need to know. I will see you guys on Monday. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. Until then, let's go Oilers.